Hi everyone, my name is José Mayub. I'm host José Mayub Path Chipstand channel. Today it's a conversation with Professor Jason Brennan about democratic theory and a little rock and roll. And final this interview, the Liberty Rock and Roll, Professor Brennan like rock and roll like me and Guy. And I would like to thank Matheus Bergman and Luis Piccini from their help from the promotional material from this interview. Guy, your turn.
Okay, I'm Guilherme. I'm the co-host of this interview with Jose, and I'm really, really happy to be interviewing Professor Jason Brennan because he's one of my favorite political authors in recent times.
Uh, so, guys, I briefly introduction to Professor Jason Brennan. I think everybody know Professor Jason Brennan, but Professor Jason Brennan, Robert and Elizabeth Flanagan Family Professor, Strategic Economics and Public Policy, McDonough School of Business, Georgetown University, Editor-in-Chief, Philosophy and Public Affairs, Association Editor, in Philosophy and Policy. Professor Brennan, it's an honor having you here.
Thanks very much for having me, guys. I appreciate your kind words.
Professor Brennan, let's start a personal question. What motivated you to study political philosophy or philosophy, especially libertarian tradition, and which thinkers or books have the most influence in your career? For example, Brian Kaplan, Robert Nozick.
Great, thanks for asking. I think I've always been interested in philosophy, or I've been interested in philosophy for a very long time. Honestly, for me, it began back in ninth grade when I was 13. I had a history teacher who was teaching world civilization and very much pushed the idea that history is driven by ideas. So I'm not sure if that thesis is actually true, but it was an interesting thesis. And because of that, I started reading John Locke and Karl Marx and a bunch of other thinkers at the time. I had this paper published in some student newspaper type thing, and it came with a an award that allowed you to buy a lot of books for low price. And so I started reading that stuff and was interested in it for a very long time. And then as I progressed, originally I planned to go to graduate school to do philosophy of mind, but I realized within the first few months of graduate school that though I enjoy that topic, I have nothing to add to it or say about it, really. I am a consumer, not a producer. And so I went back to my first love. And I especially like political philosophy because I like combining moral questions with questions of political philosophy. And I have to say, if I think there's one book that influenced me more than anything else, it was Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. Back in 11th grade, I had an economics teacher who said I should read this book and apply for write a paper for some essay contest that was based upon it. Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson is just saying when you're evaluating a policy, a proposed policy, you don't simply look at the good intentions of the people who are proposing it. You also don't look simply at the immediate consequences to the most obvious group. You need to look at the long-term and often invisible consequences to everybody. So, for instance, if someone says we should have a industrial policy in which we pay to workers to produce something over here, you see that those workers have jobs, you see that they're producing something and that looks good, but you don't usually ask the question, where did that money come from? What would that money have been used for? Would have been used for a more productive purpose, and so on. And once you start asking these deeper questions, you start thinking like an economist and you start seeing that many times the policies that people propose with the goal of doing good actually do more harm than good. So that I think was like the most influential book for me. Everything else kind of followed after that.
Great answer, Professor Brennan. Professor Brennan, how do you define the liberal democracy? I think it's not have implications different democrat and Christian democracy and liberal democracy, but how do you define the liberal democracy and your view, and what lead liberalism to reduce its skepticism? For example, it's the first liberalism, the beginning liberalism, or classical liberalism, a true democracy, and to adopt a more egalitarianism features like John Rawls, Ronald Dwork, Martin Nussbaum, and Martin Say, especially in terms of social justice.
Yeah, I mean that's a big question, and it's very difficult to define a lot of these terms. In fact, I recently reviewed a book for Notre Dame Philosophical Reviews by Herman Kaplan, where he says that the term democracy is just it's an indefensible word. It doesn't really mean much of anything. every definition we have of the word democracy just kind of sucks and we can't really fix it. We should just dispense with it. You might say the same thing about liberalism, but that said, if we have to do a first pass through it, liberal philosophies are philosophies that think every individual has a fairly extensive sphere of personal freedom, and this personal freedom should be respected and protected by others, including the government, and it's very difficult to override this sphere. So you have a lot of personal rights to make personal decisions for yourself, and these things are not easily overridden by considerations about public utility or good consequences and so on. Liberals disagree about how extensive the sphere should be, about exactly what justifies it, what goes in the sphere and what doesn't. And democratic countries are going to be countries in which, in one way or another, at some crucial step of political decision making, all of the citizens, broadly construed, have some level of equality, right? That's an overly permissive definition, and if you try to make it more fine-grained, you start excluding things you probably want to include. If you make it that broad, you probably include things you don't want to. But that's what those are supposed to be. Instead of looking around the world, basically all the places that I personally would want to live are liberal democracies, with maybe a couple exceptions. And I think there's a reason for that. As a matter of fact, liberal democracies tend to outperform other kinds of political systems that we've tried. That's not always the case. It's not the case in every particular sphere, but there's persistent reasons for that I think are pretty well understood inside of economics and political science. As far as like liberalism and egalitarianism, though, to have an overly simplified story, you might say something like early on liberalism has always been a consequentialist view. It's liberals will often say, yes, you should have freedom, and you should have freedom even when there's bad consequences, but then they'll often say, but nevertheless, generally speaking, there are very good consequences to freedom. However, many people have this view that the problem with freedom is that it leads to too much inequality, and we need to rectify that. And so part of what they'll do is chip away at the sphere of personal freedom to not include economic liberty inherently, because they want to make things more equal. I think people often have a very powerful intuition that when they think about society, they often think of it as if we're all living under one roof, and Nana has just made like a pie for all the children. All the grandchildren are going to get a slice of the pie. And then grandma cuts up the pie unequally. So some of the grandkids get big slices of pie and some get small slices of pie. And that's very unfair. And our job is to recognize the unfairness of the way that grandma has sliced up the pie and redistribute the slices to make them more equal. When you look at egalitarian philosophies, they almost always start with thought experiments like that, or thought experiments like we're all on a boat, we come across a deserted island simultaneously, and we ask how we're going to divide up the apples that are already there. So I think egalitarians are basing their philosophy on powerful intuitions, but the question is whether the thought experiments they use are in any way analogous to what's actually happening in the real world. Because it's not the case that, say, the president of any of our countries like divides up all the wealth and just gives it to some people fairly and unfairly. It's not where wealth comes from. It's not how income is distributed. But we can talk at greater length about that, I think.
Great answer, Professor Brennan. Professor Brennan, in your view, what is the connection between political philosophy and applied epistemology? And what reasons lead you to defend an epistemological argument within political philosophy against the ideal of democratic egalitarianism?
I think one question is, why do we value democracy? Right. So some people value it simply because it's a mechanism for expressing the idea that we're equal. I don't think that's a very powerful argument. If we just want to express that people are equal, we could have statues of equality. We could have national poets who write poems about equality and so on. Zoe, my dog's over there and she's heard something and needs to bark at it. She's usually very quiet, but now that we're live online, she's decided to bark. Uh, um, all right. So other arguments are things like democracy is supposed to empower us. Right. That's what's good about democracy is what's good about a market, and that you get to make personal decisions and you are in some way the author of the law and deciding things for yourself. I think that argument is just not very plausible. And I'll give you an analogy with an anecdote. So there's a South African food chain called Nando's Peri Peri. It sells like kind of spicy Portuguese chicken and like South African peppers on it. I'm sorry, Zoe, you need to be quiet, please. Shh. She never barks. Now she's doing it. She's just far out of reach, so I can't grab her. So Nando's Peri Peri back, I think it was 2022, had this publicity stunt in New York City where they were offering people what they called an undemocratic meal. The idea is when you walk in, you could say, I'd like to have the undemocratic meal. And then if you selected that, a bunch of PR people in the back would put together some disgusting food for you. Like it might be a brownie with Portuguese rice on top of it with hot sauce and mayonnaise. It's gross. And the joke was supposed to be this is what happens when you're not in a democracy. The dictators get to decide what they give you, and they could give you anything that they want. Fair enough. But notice what they didn't offer was a democratic meal. A democratic meal would be you walk into Nando's Peri Peri, you order what you want, and then they ignore that and just give you what the majority wants. Right. So like I order, say, half side of chicken with extra spicy sauce, and they say, well, most people don't like spicy sauce, so you're getting garlic sauce instead. Right. And I order like rice, but like most people want French fries, so you're getting that instead. So the problem with democracy, it's not empowering in the sense of empowering you as an individual. It's not even meant to. It does what the plurality wants. It doesn't do what any individual within that plurality wants. You're subjugated to the collective, if not subjugated to any particular individual, and that's when it's working as intended. So the final argument people make for democracy, which I think is the best argument, is just as a matter of fact, it serves people's interests more than the alternatives. And that's fundamentally my view of democracy. Democracy has the same kind of value that this ruler has. Happen to have this like tool next to me. This thing is valuable, and democracy is more valuable than this ruler, but it has that kind of value. It's an instrument for promoting certain kinds of ends, and that's my view of democracy. The reason we have it is because it does a better job promoting our interests than alternative forms of government that we've tried. That's really all that can be said on behalf of it. And if that's the view, then if it turns out that it has systematic defects, that's a problem. And if it turns out that there are alternative forms of government that work better, we should consider using those. The question is not whether it has systematic defects. It definitely does, and we know what they are. It's whether any other alternative form of government could be superior. We don't really know that. We have some speculation, but we don't know until we try it. And trying things is dangerous.
Professor Brennan, I have a simple introduction question, especially one of my favorite books in political philosophy against democracy, in your book, of course. What is the three characters you describe in your book, the Roberts, Vulcanus, and Hooligans? And I like so much your reference nerds. Star Trek, it's a better Star Wars for me.
Looks like he's frozen, but should I just go on and answer the question? Yeah. Great. So in Against Democracy, I introduced three basic. What part of what happens in Against Democracy is I want to summarize a large body of empirical research on voter behavior, and there's a lot of variation in how voters think, how opinionated they are, how many opinions they have, how strongly they hold them, why they vote for the particular party, to what degree does their political ideology form part of their characterization of themselves? Is it an essential part of who they are? Is it something that they do on the side? How often and how much they participate and so on. There's lots of variation, but despite there being lots of variation, you really can put most people into two categories that I call hobbits and hooligans. So hobbits are based upon the characters in the Lord of the Rings novels. Hobbits don't really care about the grand cosmic battle between good and evil. They're mostly just concerned with living their own basic lives. And the political analog of that would be the typical person who chooses not to vote in the modern democracy. When we look at those people, we find they have very few political opinions. What political opinions they have are very unstable. If they do bother vote, it's often on the basis of impressions. They don't necessarily care much about any particular party. They don't identify strongly with any political ideology or any political party. They're just not that concerned about politics. And that's roughly in the United States about half of the population. And it varies from country to country what the percentage would be. Then when you look at the next group of people, I call them hooligans. So I think about football fans, like very strong like football fans. Like for instance, I went to a football game in Sao Paulo, and they divided up. I was between like two rival teams. I can't remember the names of the teams, but it was like sort of the Sao Paulo City team versus the Sao Paulo State team, if I remember correctly. And there were metal barricades. You couldn't cross from the stadium from one side to the other. You had to go about 3 kilometers outside the stadium to cross from one side to the other. There were police everywhere. The maitre d' of my hotel told me to wear neutral colors so that I wouldn't be seen as a fan of either team. And when you look at sports fans, you often find that they have much more information. They identify strongly with the team, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're smart or unbiased. In fact, what tends to happen is that people interpret information in a very self-serving way. So, for instance, if a penalty is called against a player in our team, we think it's unfair. If it's called against a player on the other team, we think it's fair. We don't have any special information. We just interpret it the way that we want. If we're accused of cheating, we think that's like fake. If they're accused of cheating, that seems right. And also notice that you don't really care so much about the players. You just care about whoever's wearing the uniform. So, for instance, in American football, the quarterback of my favorite team is Drake May. I'm from an area called New England, so I root for the New England Patriots. Drake May is now my favorite quarterback that's playing in the league, but that's because he's my quarterback. If he can't, but if in a couple years from now, if he leaves our team and goes and plays for a rival team, I won't be a fan of him anymore. I'll be a fan of whoever our new guy is. And surprisingly, it turns out this is how people reason about politics too. The story that I was told in sixth grade is that people vote for parties because they agree with the party. I have an ideology and I find the party that best matches my ideology and I vote for them. It turns out that's wrong. For most people, that is not true. For most people, instead, it's I'm going to vote for the same party over and over and over again. And then whatever they happen to advocate, I will advocate too. I don't really care about their ideas. I'm just a member of that party. We know this by looking at what happens when parties change their minds. When a party changes its platform, do people leave the party and go to another party, or do they stick with it and change their mind? It turns out they stick overwhelmingly, people stick with the party. They change their beliefs to conform to whatever the party says. And the craziest part is they don't know that they've done it. If you ask, we know this from lots of surveys, if you ask people, why did you change your mind? 6 months ago, we interviewed you and you said you were in favor of free trade. Now you say you're in favor of tariffs. Why did you change your mind? The most common answer is, I've always thought this. I didn't change my mind. This is just how I think. So people are affiliating with parties for other reasons, mostly social reasons, not really because of ideology. So my view is that overwhelmingly in a democracy, what you have are hobbits and hooligans. You do not have a large number of hyper-rational, perfectly informed, perfectly rational people, what we might call Vulcans. They basically don't exist. Democracy, as is every other form of government, is the rule of hobbits and hooligans. The reason I bring this up is because many times when people talk about how democracy is supposed to work, they're imagining us behaving like Vulcans. We're not Vulcans. We're hobbits and hooligans. Our political theories have to reflect that. Our attitudes towards democracy have to reflect that as well. I basically think overwhelmingly the most democratic theory that's been written in defense of democracy is irrelevant to actual democracy. It's like, imagine if I said monarchy is good because under a monarchy, you'll have an all-wise, all-knowing king or queen who wants to do the right thing and consults directly with God to find out what the right thing is and then does it. And then you go, no actual monarchy has ever worked that way. And I go, I'm just talking about ideal theory. That would be nuts, right? But that's effectively what democratic theorists tend to do. They don't defend any democracy as we find them. They defend these ideal models of democracy that are relevant to the real world.
Great answer, Professor Brennan. Suppose the Vulcanos. I happy it's real my question, but it's imagination. So sorry. Vulcanos, it's prevail over the hooligans and hobbits. How does, in scenario, your epistemological framework distinguish the truth beliefs from false ones? Or more specific, Professor Brennan, how do you deal with problem justification? It's a common problem in epistemology, especially contemporary epistemology. For example, rationality choice should be well justified, of course, but it's possible to have a good justification from false belief, right? Mm-hmm. So, Professor Brennan, in this case, how can we make sure that rational choice, especially like Vulcanos, are not affected by false beliefs?
Yeah, great question. In a way, I'm going to punt on this because I think the question presupposes something that might not be quite right. Let me give you an analogy. I have this view that when you are ruling over other people, you have an obligation to be competent and to act in good faith. So my view is, if you act incompetently or in bad faith, you should not have power. I think this applies to basically everyone who has power, from a police officer to a voter to a president or prime minister to Congress people to judges to, it doesn't matter, to parents, when you exercise power over other people, you're obligated to act competently and in good faith. And then someone might say, well, Jason Brennan, what is your particular view of what competence is? What exactly is good faith? And whatever theory I give, it's going to be a very precise theory. And then they could nitpick that and say, oh, that's not quite right. What about this? And then, then they might think, so does your argument fall apart if you don't have the right theory of competence and good faith? The reality is I don't actually need to take much of a strong stance on this, because when I say that the typical voter is incompetent or that many politicians are acting in bad faith, I'm not relying upon any controversial view about what epistemology is, what exactly constitutes justification. We can look at a bunch of just basic facts about how little people know and about the way they reason, and every plausible theory of epistemology, every plausible theory of competence is going to say that that's incompetence, that that's irrational belief, or that it's ignorance. So, for instance, to take some American statistics, every couple of years there's this thing called the American National Election Studies, and one of the things it does is it surveys voters about what they know, and it finds they basically don't know much of anything. They know who the president is, they know who the vice president is, but they don't know what parties have done, what parties stand for, what bills have been passed recently, what various national statistics are. They don't know what the different branches of government are able to do. They're not able to attribute responsibility to different party. They can't tell you how any of the trends that are occurring have anything to do with like various policies that have been passed. Just really, even like very basic stuff, they don't know that. So basically, any theory about political competence is going to say that this is important information that you would need. Like, if you're going to vote competently, you need to know like what your party stands for, what they're able to do, and what they're going to try to do, maybe what they've done. They don't know any of that stuff, right? Or if I say something like, people, instead of apportioning their belief according to evidence, what they do is they decide what they want to believe, and then they seek out the evidence that confirms that and ignore all the evidence that disconfirms that. I don't have to take a stance on epistemology to say that that's irrational. It's not like, well, is that irrational according to process reliabilism, or what is it irrational according to internalism? Is it irrational according to probabilism? It's like they all say that's irrational. So in a sense, what makes the argument work, insofar as it works, is I'm not taking a strong stance on competence, on rationality, on epistemology. It's like all of our theories say that this is bad stuff. It's in the same way. It's like if you said, you think it's wrong to kick babies in the face for fun, what's your background moral theory? And it's like every moral theory says it's wrong to kick babies in the face for fun. So it doesn't matter if I'm, a Rossian deontologist or a consequentialist, they all agree, right?
So I was thinking about what you said earlier about that voters mainly stick to their parties that they identify with. I remember that I really like English politics, British
Mhm.
politics in general, and when John Major lost the general election to Labour, Tony Blair took over as prime minister, and they had basically very similar economic policies that the Conservatives had before, and not much change. Actually, Margaret Thatcher used to say that her biggest political legacy was New Labour, and despite that, many people who identified as left wing voted for Labour, despite they having very similar economic policies that the Conservatives had. So that leads me to ask you, in terms of idealized political theory, do, I know that you have a background on public choice theory. I know
Mhm.
that you uh, have read a lot about it. And how does public choice theory help one see through this ideal model of democracy and democratic decision? And how does it show the limitations in your view?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's a great question. One way of putting it is when we're asking about institutions, we have to ask what we're asking. Are we asking what would the perfect state look like? If we're doing that, we probably don't even have a state. We're just saying, imagine everyone is morally perfect. They have the same limitations in terms of physical and mental ability they have now, but I take everyone's morality meter and I put it all the way up to 10, right? Under those circumstances, it's not clear we need government at all. We would probably have something called cooperative anarchy. Almost every argument for the state presupposes that people are morally flawed, right? So there's a sense in which if someone's like, "What do you think about ideal democracy?" And I know you're not asking that, but I'm answering this question because I think other people listening might be thinking that. Under ideal conditions, would we have democracy? No. Under ideal conditions, we'd be anarchist. The state exists as a response to human depravity. It's sort of like asking what kind of state we would have under ideal conditions is like asking what kind of police force we'd have in utopia. We don't have the police in utopia. We don't have an army. We don't have jails, and we don't have a state. We don't need it. But under realistic conditions, with real people, then we have to ask important questions. And the basic idea of public choice is that human beings are human beings, right? Human nature, whatever human nature is, doesn't magically change because you give somebody power. So, empirically speaking, humans are overwhelmingly selfish. They're not perfectly selfish. They're not sociopaths. Very few people are literally sociopaths, but generally speaking, people are more selfish than they are altruistic, and their altruism is limited to generally like their family and a couple close friends. Proof of this, and sometimes I say this and people think I'm wrong, and I'm like, oh no, I can prove it. Reach behind you and feel your back. Do you have two kidneys? Great. You're pretty selfish because when you were 20, you could have given away one of your kidneys to save somebody's life at basically no real cost to yourself long term, and you didn't because you don't love other people all that much. A lot of people say things, no, I'm very kind. I vote for increased taxes. So when I cast a vote, which costs me nothing, I ask the government to tax other people and take their money and give it to other people. That's not generosity or kindness, like at all. Like you get literally no moral credit for that. Even if your policies are right, you get no moral credit for that because it doesn't cost you anything. If you go and volunteer for an hour, that costs you more than if you like vote for somebody. So people are pretty selfish and they're also power grabbing, they're status seeking, they want approval and so on. This is how they are in their ordinary lives. And we have to work with that. So good institutions channel these behaviors into publicly beneficial ends. Bad institutions don't. Many times when people talk about government, they treat it as if it were magical and exempt from these things. So this often happens for, say, in like econ textbooks, especially like in the 1950s. They would say, here is a market failure, a situation in which markets systematically make a particular kind of mistake. In principle, a perfect government could identify the problem, come up with a solution, and implement that solution. So they imagine a perfect government producing a particular policy, and then they imagine everyone abiding by the policy exactly as it's intended, and it produces certain results. That's not how the real world works. What public choice says we have to do is whenever we're asking what we should do, we don't just look at market failure, we look at government failure. We look at questions about, will the government have the right interest in mind? Will it make the right decision? Will people actually comply with that decision, etc.? So just to take an easy example of a government failure, take alcohol prohibition in the 1920s in the United States, right? Alcohol prohibitionists had a point. Alcohol, I mean, I'm not a big drinker. I'm not a teetotaler either. I'll probably have like a drink tonight at some point. But alcohol causes a lot of problems to a lot of people. I can see why someone would want to get rid of it. They have a point. But then when they actually prohibit alcohol in the United States, what happens is not alcohol disappears and people stop drinking it, but rather a black market appears, alcohol is provided by the mafia, and in fact, the total amount of violence that happens because of alcohol goes up, the number of deaths from alcohol go up, gangs become more powerful, and so on. These were all predictable consequences of this government policy. But when they implemented the policy, they didn't think through the consequences. They just imagined it working exactly as intended. We passed a law and then everyone will abide by it. That's not how it works. Or to take another mundane example, one close to my heart, you can think of it like this: the power to help people is also the power to distribute favors. And so when you create an institution whose job is to help people, different kinds of people compete for that. Some people try to get that power because they want to help people, and they'll actually help. Some people will compete for that power because they want to help people, but they'll hurt because they have no idea what they're doing. They're just dumb. They're making mistakes. But other people will compete with that power because they want to use it to smite their enemies and help themselves. A good example of this actually happens in the United States in our college education programs. In the United States, generally speaking, when you get a college degree, you don't just major in a particular subject and read that one subject. Like, in British universities, you'll go to, say, read politics and you just study politics for 3 years and then you walk out with a bachelor's degree. In the US, we tend to make you take a bunch of classes in different subjects. The purported goal of this is to make you well-rounded. Okay, whether you should do that or not is a good question. My colleague and I did some research on this, and what we found was these general education classes do not actually promote the skills they're supposed to. Measurably, they don't. They're basically failures. So why do they persist? Well, the main reason they persist is that if I'm in, say, in the English department and I force you to take classes in my department gets more money. Every butt in the seat means cash for us. So what happens is departments, especially it turns out the poorest departments, the departments with the least amount of money and the worst financial prospects, spend a lot of their time lobbying the general education committees to force students to take classes in their department. The biggest predictor that you will be made to take a class in a particular department in the US is the financial neediness of those departments, not the skills or anything else. So this was a thing that was created purportedly to help students, and what's actually turned into is an institution by which faculty exploit the students. That's at universities. This kind of behavior happens all over. It happens quite a bit in democratic governments. So, it's called rent seeking, and a number of public choice economists identified this many, many years ago. It's a pervasive phenomenon, and we have to be worried about it.
So, you talked about human nature earlier when you were starting to answer my question. And in this vein, Professor Brennan, since we know that human nature is very tribal,
Mm.
and since that tribal identity is so deeply ingrained and affects not just ignorance, but motivated reasoning and bias, can enlightened preference voting truly separate tribal affiliation from policy preferences when constructing the ideally informed voter?
Yeah, great question. So we have to identify what enlightened preference voting is for people. The idea behind enlightened preference voting is this. Right now, typically when you have an election or a referendum, you just show up and you cast a vote, and then we have some sort of counting method or whatever it might be that determines who wins based upon how you vote. Enlightened preference voting is an attempt to determine what we would have wanted if we were fully informed. The way that it works is, let's say we're having an election for who's going to be our member of parliament. When you show up, you do three things. First, you tell us who you are, your demographics, like, are you employed? Where do you live? What's your ethnic identity, and so on. There's an interesting question about what the categories are, but let's just say we've got that settled. The second thing you do is you take a test of some sort, a test of basic political knowledge. This test does not determine whether or not your vote gets counted. It's not a are you allowed to vote test. It's just a thing that determines, well, I'll tell you what it means, but it basically determines, like, what do you know? And then we can use that later to figure something out. The third thing we do is you tell us what you want. So when we have this data for everybody, not just one person, but for many, many people, tens of thousands or millions of people, we can then use basic statistics to do the following. We can say, we can estimate what would a demographically identical public have wanted if it were fully informed. If it had gotten a perfect score on the test and we looked the same, what would we want? And this is a way of estimating how knowledge affects preferences while controlling for demographics. Because it controls for demographics, it eliminates like the bias of things like, well, better informed people say tend to be richer than poor. Like poor people tend to be less informed, rich people tend to be better informed. So when we find out that a better informed person wants this and not that, is it the money that's doing it, or is it their information? This method is the way that we determine that it's information and not income. It's the thing that controls for that. Now, you're right. It doesn't try to fix people. It does not eliminate their personal biases. It doesn't try to make their reasoning better. It's just a way of simulating what we would have wanted if we were better informed. It doesn't perfectly eradicate all these various background biases. That said, you can also test demographics with it. So you can, once you've got this method in place, you can do things like, say, hypothetically, what would happen if the population were entirely male? What would happen if the population were entirely female? What would happen if the population were rich? What would happen if the population were poor? So you can do these kind of robustness checks to see how much of the outcomes are affected by pure information versus the demographic background. What do you do with that information is a big philosophical question, but at the very least, with enlightened preference voting, you can start testing these hypotheses. How much is this being driven by the demographic spread of the country versus information? And by the way, when you say that people are tribal, it is true. We're still tribalistic. We still have this in-group, out-group thing. I would say, though, that one of the benefits of Western civilization, or one of the, maybe not benefits of it, one of the interesting things about Western civilization is what we call individualistic Western cultures aren't really. People often make it sound like non-Western cultures are collective and kind and communal, and Western cultures are individualistic and anti-communal. That's really not fair. Western cultures are cooperative with strangers. That's the thing. They value individuals, but they also show a strong tendency to be cooperative with people they've never met, to be trusting of them, to be trustworthy of them, to be disposed to cooperate with them, to play fair, and so on. Non-Western cultures tend to be communal, but communal within the group. So there's a tendency for Westerners to have an expanded view of who the tribe is. The tribe can be everybody. It's not just my in-group, it's everybody. And that gets expanded outward and outward. Why this is the case is a big, interesting philosophical question, for instance, or empirical question. There's a really cool book by Joseph Henrich called The Weirdest People in the World. His claim is that it's the Catholic Church's fault. He basically says that the Catholic Church, 1,000 years ago, or a little more than that, started forbidding people from marrying their cousins. And at some point, you couldn't marry your second, third, fourth, or even fifth cousin. And the result of that is that tribal identities were broken down, and people had to adopt these patterns of behavior of being cooperative and accepting of strangers. And then this led to these kind of Western things where we are cooperative and less tribalistic than others.
Was very interesting what you said. I never thought about that in that way, that Western civilization sees the tribe as more than the in-group. It's very, very insightful. And in a way, if you think about it, when we're talking about Asian cultures, maybe Confucianism uh, tried not tried they made Asian culture more insulated than it already was, because of its like was I don't know the specific word for it, but it's very rigid structure of societal norms made uh, people more intolerant of the outgroup. I don't know. I'm just theorizing here. And while we're in this philosophical argument, from a we were Jose and I we were talking about the Nozick Rawls debate, right? So from a Nozickian perspective, what do you see as the key disagreement between Rawls and Nozick, and why and which of Nozick's critiques still matter most today?
Yeah. I like to think, I'm writing for Oxford University Press right now. I'm writing Libertarianism, a very short introduction. I keep writing these like overviews of libertarian books. I get asked to do it, and it's worth doing. And so I'm having to grapple with that question right now. Here's what I like about Nozick's method. He has all these really cool thought experiments. He's got like really nice arguments, but his fundamental method is this. He goes, why are you making an exception? Right. So someone like Rawls was like, actually, I'll just describe a debate I had with Sam Freeman recently in a book that we had together. Sam Freeman, to be funny, if Rawls is Jesus, Sam Freeman is St. Paul, right? That's like the role that he plays. So Freeman says to me, well, the problem with libertarianism is that it might allow racism, right? Like it can allow people to have racist attitudes in markets. Like I could just decide I own a business and I'm not going to hire anyone who has a certain ethnicity. Now, to be clear, he's not even necessarily saying that it will cause that. There's this really cool empirical work by people like Gary Becker that says, as a matter of fact, in competitive markets, if you have racist attitudes, you will get punished by the market for this. The argument is something like, imagine for the sake of argument that like I just hate Brazilians. And I falsely believe that Brazilians are like less productive than Americans. I never hire any Brazilians, right? Well, what I've done is I've handed all my competitors a gift because my belief is mistaken. They can hire Brazilians at a lower price. In fact, they would be smart to only hire Brazilians since they're now cheaper because of my discriminatory attitudes, and they'll make more money and more profit than I do. And then in a competitive market, I get punished. So Freeman, I think, if he's being smart, would admit that markets don't reward racist behavior. And in fact, they have a built-in mechanism to punish it. But nevertheless, he would say it would allow it. It would allow you to be racist, and that means that we should forbid it. But the thing is, he doesn't extend that elsewhere. So he's still a liberal. And so you can say, okay, Friedman, like you say freedom is bad because it allows a bad thing. But you also endorse freedoms that would allow a bad thing. According to you, John Rawls and Sam Freeman, I'm allowed to refuse to vote for a candidate because of race. Like they don't want to have an intervention. Suppose like in the last election, I voted for Trump instead of Harris because I hate black people. They don't want to have, they think that's wrong, but they wouldn't have an intervention to stop me. I'm allowed to refuse to work at a workplace because I don't like the racial makeup of the people there. I'm allowed to refuse to pick a particular profession because I don't like the race of the people in it. Like, maybe I don't want to work in landscaping because I think Mexicans are overrepresented in that. Like I don't like Mexicans. They would allow that. I'm allowed to refuse to date anyone of a different ethnicity. I'm allowed to choose to live in a neighborhood that has ethnic homogeneity, and then if that ethnic homogeneity goes away, I'm allowed to move. So even on their view, freedom allows all these sorts of racist things. And you can have racist speech, for instance. So I think notice what I've done there. It's like they make an argument against freedom, and I go, okay, fair enough, but that argument doesn't just attack economic liberty, it attacks all of liberty. What's different? What's special? And this, I think, is fundamentally Nozick's method. Over and over, he says to his readers, you want to regulate the market. You want to interfere with economic freedom. You want to do all these things. And you have all these really interesting arguments for it about inequality, about paternalism, etc. But if I take these arguments seriously, they don't just call for constricting economic liberty, they call for restricting almost everything. What's the difference? Now, to be fair to Rawlsians, they try to give an answer. They say, oh, well, there's a difference. There's what are called basic liberties and non-basic liberties, and civil liberties are basic, and these ones aren't, right? But that's just giving a name to them. It's like, well, what it means to be a basic liberty for them is this is a personal liberty that you are owed that is not overridden by these other kinds of considerations. Okay, fair enough. But why is economic liberty in one category and not the other? They try to give an answer to this, and their answer just doesn't work. In part because they never worked it out. Like the weird thing was, like, basically 60 years ago, Rawls gave an answer to that. It was a very strict answer. It was like, liberty, it comes as a basic liberty if and only if it has the right kind of relationship to your moral personality. And in order to show it has the right kind of relationship to your moral personality, is a very stringent test. And then he doesn't even bother to show that any of the liberties qualify. He spends like a couple pages gesturing at maybe how freedom of conscience is sort of helpful, but that's it. And then, like, since then, no one's done any of the work. So maybe there is a distinction between these things, but they haven't really shown it. I think libertarians like Nozick would say, on its face, different liberties matter to different people. Like, as an academic, my freedom of expression, my freedom of association, my freedom to travel matter a lot to me. I make heavy, heavy use of those things. My freedom to start a business doesn't really matter that much to me. But, if I were flipping around, if I pointed, say, a neighbor who's an entrepreneur, for them, economic liberties matter a huge amount to their personal life and to them being authors of their own lives. But they wouldn't care about academic freedom. Who cares? Like, why not have the government regulate what physicists are allowed to say? That doesn't matter to them. I think, in fact, what Nozick would say is there's a lot of diversity among humans about which freedoms matter to their self-authorship. It's not that there's one set of freedoms that matters to everybody. It just varies quite a bit. So by default, we should say everyone should have an extensive, if you have any liberal pretensions at all, by default, everyone should have an extensive sphere of liberty that includes economic decisions, social decisions, personal decisions, civics, etc. And it's always a barrier and a burden to show that that should be restricted. There's really heavy burdens to show that. There's nothing special about one set of liberties versus another.
Professor Brennan, it's a brilliant answer. Thank you so much. It's a really class about the Nozick and Rawls. Professor Brennan, that's my last question. But after I open the audience questions, I think at 3 or 4, it's perfect for you.
Sure.
Okay. Professor Brennan, this question, especially Professor Denis Coutinho, it's a professor in Brazil in philosophy and law. It's a famous paper. Criticism your work against epistocracy, with respect, of course. He agrees your epistocracy, it's possible creates many forms of plutocracy, injustice, social inequality, politicians. But in my opinion, my question for you is, do you agree your democracy creates inequality politicians and inequality social justice? And do you think this inequality is compassion from a more free market, more decision maker politicians within reason and the technical approach? What's your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And the answer is we don't really know what it would do. Right. I often find, and I'm not necessarily saying that he's making this mistake, but I often find that when people try to criticize me, they defend the best case scenario for democracy and then the worst case scenario for epistocracy and conclude that democracy is better, which is, playing the game on easy mode. We have reason to think that epistocracies would have certain kinds of policies based upon the research that we've done. But the deeper question is, like every single political system ends up being corrupted. They also behave differently in different places. So, you know, democracy doesn't work quite as well in Brazil as it does in Denmark, right? That's fair enough. It's like more or less the same institutions. We get very different results. Similarly, I would say epistocracy would be much more likely to be plutocratic in Brazil than it would be in Denmark, because of just differences about background cooperativeness and other factors that are hard to quantify. And in the US, I think would be in between, like on those two countries. Like, so we don't really know till we try it. And then for me, the question is not, will it have some of these pernicious effects? You were asking about public choice earlier. I do not have rose-eyed goggles when I'm looking at any of these things. I think every institution will be corrupted. It will be captured by special interest and so on. For me, the question is just, all things considered, will it perform better? I don't think there's any reason to think epistocracy will be especially pernicious. If you think of what epistocracy is, it's we look at systematic defects in democracy. We understand where those incentives come from, and we try to come up with institutions that, to some degree, rectify those defects. The best version of this worry would be take enlightened preference voting. We're going to have some sort of test that we use to weigh votes, right? Could that be captured by special interest to try to promote their own party? It could be. I have some proposals about how to reduce the probability of that happening, but we don't really know. And by the way, one thing I think people miss about Against Democracy, a lot of people read the book Against Democracy and they think the point of Against Democracy is to try to prove to the reader we should have epistocracy. It's not the point. The point of Against Democracy is to say democracy only has instrumental value. That's it. It has no intrinsic value. It's not good as an end in itself. It's not good for what it symbolizes. It is a tool. All it is, democracy is a ruler. That's all it is. It's this. So if we can find a better version of this, we should use it. Maybe epistocracy is one. And then one of the reasons I use epistocracy in the book is because it's something that a lot of people find intrinsically repugnant. And I want to be like, actually, it might be a better ruler. We don't really know until we try it, until we experiment. But you should be open to that. And this flies against the idea where many people, when I say democracy, to them, it's a sacred value, but it's not. It's not a sacred value. It's just a tool.
Professor Brennan, complete my question. How do you read the tension between ideal theory and practical politics? Because many criticism about your thought, it's a very ideal government, ideal system, but in politics I agree. Hume and Hobbes, a political system, politician, it's artificial creative humanity. In your opinion, what is the conflict between ideal politics and practical politics?
Yeah, I mean, practical politics, we're asking moral questions. There are questions about, like, is this not our business to deal with at all, right? But then once we've decided this is the kind of thing which potentially could be determined by politics, then we ask questions about what sorts of interventions or policies could we implement? How would they work in the real world, given perverse incentives, given institutional capture, given strategic non-compliance by citizens? We compare government failure to market failure. We look at not just markets, but we look at alternative possible policies, including what civil society might do. We don't just ask about the short term, we also ask about the long-term effects of creating certain kinds of institutions and how that empowers people and so on. When we're doing ideal politics, so I think most political questions that are interesting are non-ideal. And maybe a way of putting it is, there's this weird thing that happens in philosophy where ideal theory is seen as higher status than doing this kind of applied non-ideal theory. I actually can't figure out why that's the case, because ideal theory is super easy. It's like the difference between doing arithmetic and doing advanced calculus, right? It's like if I'm doing ideal theory, I get to sit in my armchair and I imagine angels doing exactly what I want. And I ask, of all the different ways angels could behave, what's the best one? It's pretty easy, right? If I want to ask about what policy should we implement in the real world, I have to know all of this social science. It's incredibly complicated. So I just think they're very different questions. Ideal theory, it's like, what should we do? We should be cooperative anarchists. But that doesn't tell us what to do in the real world where people are pretty terrible.
So now it's audience questions. Gui, read I describe the chat of the Zoom, the audience question. It's better question,
Right.
in my opinion. And start Diego question.
Yeah. So Diego asks, on what non-secular grounds can an epistocratic system determine who counts as politically competent? Competent.
Yeah, and if those are deemed knowers or the ones empowered to rule, what would prevent from being self-serving? I think here's the funny thing about this, and I see another question on there from Luis Piccini. Uh, the I think they're often criticizing what's probably the least defensible version of epistocracy. So there's many different kinds of epistocracy, just like there are many kinds of democracy, right? Uh, One crude version of epistocracy is you get to vote if and only if you pass a test. That's very problematic. It's the least defensible version of it. It's not the one that I advocate, though, I did have an early paper that mentioned that, but it's not the one that I've been defending for the past like 15 years, basically. So, what I envision with regard to enlightened preference voting is something like this. 3 weeks before the election or 6 weeks before the election, the government randomly selects, say, 500 citizens, and they are given, say, $6,000 each or something like that to go spend a weekend together where they're going to write the competence exam. They're brought in to say, you, the citizens, have been chosen to decide what counts as political competence. You're going to write 30 questions that you think a voter should know the answer to. When you ask yourself, what is an informed voter? What questions do you think they should know the answer to? You come up with 30 questions. They can be anything you want. It could be, if you want, it could be, what's the price of Coke Zero? Right? That's what you think they should know. That's fine. And then you leave it to them. They're likely to come up with a pretty smart set of questions, including they might actually think it's relevant what the price of certain products are that might matter for making political decisions. What's the price of daycare, et cetera. So they might think these things are important. They come up with the questions, and then those are the questions that get used to determine political competence. So once you do that, they're picking it. So it's not a bunch of elites deciding what the questions are. It's the non-elites. I'm actually willing to use democracy to decide what counts as a smart person. That might seem paradoxical because you're like, you think people don't know anything. But my analogy for this is if I were to ask my kids are 14 and 18 now, but when I started using this, they were children. So first time I said this, I was like, if I were to ask my child who is 6 years old at the time I first came up with this point, what does it take? What counts as a good marriage partner? Despite being six, I actually asked him. He actually had a very good theory of what is a good wife or a good husband. As a 6-year-old, he had a good sense of that. Does that mean he's competent to pick a spouse at age 6? No. Right. Similarly, you might have taken a test before, say in college or university, where you knew what was going to be on the test in the sense these are the questions. Like I'm taking organic chemistry. I know they're going to ask me about what happens when a ketone is, mixed with an aldehyde at like a certain temperature in the presence of platinum. That's going to be on the test, but they don't actually know the answer to the question. So voters, if you ask the typical voter, what does it take to be an informed voter? They know the questions. They just don't have the answers. Right. So we're letting the people decide what counts as informed. It's not me. It's not an elite. It's not a bureaucracy. It's not, the Koch brothers or someone else. It's let the people decide what counts as informed. So that's my way of making it self-referential. And I think they'll come up with a pretty good account. And I think the idea is like, let's try that and see what happens. Does it get better results overall? Instead of being like we're excluding voters on the basis of this.
Key, do you have one question?
And on that point, with Luis Piccini as well, because people often say like they're imagining what I'm saying is we're only going to let the smart people vote, but the smart people are very biased, right? This whole system is not about fixing anyone. It's not saying those people know better than those people, let them rule. I think they're all idiots. I don't think there's anyone on the planet who's competent to rule another person. Like no president has ever been competent. No congressperson is competent. No judge is competent. They're all fools and idiots. They really are. They suck, right? I don't think if I said, do you think you're better entitled to rule than the average person, Jay Brennan? Sure. But that's like a little bit like saying like, I'm slightly stronger than the average person. So if I tried to bench press the moon, I'd be a little bit better at it. It's like, it's bullshit. We all suck. This system is not fixing people. We can't fix them. They're terrible. And the reason they're terrible is because of perverse incentives that we can't rectify. What it's doing instead is trying to simulate what the public would have wanted if it were less biased and more informed without fixing the bias. So high information voters tend to be very biased, and low information voters, the only reason they're not that biased is because they just don't care. If they started being informed, they would also become biased as well. We're not fixing that. We're trying to reduce the problems that it causes.
So, one last question. I think you answered Piccini with your answer right now,
Mm,
and but Matteo Santiago um, he asks you. No, that's not it. Uh, uh, what what I wanted to ask you, Professor Brennan, is that I've been reading James Brennan recently. No, I'm not a new reactionary. Don't worry about it.
mm.
I just find his work to be very interesting when he talks about elite capture and the elite theory of power. Um, so I worry that sometimes that, but you already answered that epistocratic institutions are more vulnerable to this kind of elite capture. What, as you said before, it's not about an elite. Um, but what do you think about competitive federalism? Don't you think it's a little bit less vulnerable to capture than centralized epistocracy, since dissatisfied citizens can exit rather than needing to convince the order, those who will represent the population, like the what we would call the epistocratic elite? Because I've been reading a lot of Eleanor Ostrom's work, and I was very captivated by it.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I agree. And by the way, it's funny, just as a side note, people often bring up elite capture as an argument against epistocracy, and then they go, "All right, fair enough. I've been complaining about elite capture with regard to regulatory institutions forever. What do you worry about there?" And they're like, "Oh no, I don't mean it here. I only take out this weapon and use it against you. I don't use it against any of the things I stand for." It's like they're not even being sincere 90% of the time. But for the 10% of people who are, I would say something like this. Epistocracy is not a competitor to decentralization, to federalism, to devolution of government, to localism, right? So it's like there are all these interesting questions about how we should design democracy. Should we have a uniparliamentary system or a bicameral legislature? Great question. The question about epistocracy does not answer that. I have an opinion on it, but it's not part of the theory. Should we have a parliamentary system or a strong presidential system or a weakly presidential system? Great question. I have an opinion. Epistocracy doesn't answer it. Should there be a lot of centralization? Should there be a lot of federalism? Great question. I have an opinion. I think federalism is better for the reasons you said. I think foot voting is really important and it disciplines us more than other things. Um, but epistocracy is not an answer to that. What should we actually subject to government? What is the scope of government? How many things should be under government's control? I have an answer to that, but it's not part of it. Like people often go, well, you're a type of libertarian, so epistocracy, this is a libertarian theory. It's like, no, it's not at all a libertarian theory. If I changed my economics tomorrow, I would still have this view. It's an independent thing. Um, so that's a good question. Uh, who should or what should we vote on? Interesting. Like, should we have direct democracy? Should we be voting on bills directly, or should we have representative government? Another really important question. Epistocracy doesn't answer that question. It's more like whatever those answers to those other questions, settle those independently, and then ask the following question: would it work better if we had an enlightened preference voting method, or would it work better if we had democracy as we have it? And one other final thing about democracy is already elite capture. In fact, some people defend it on that grounds. A lot of the very sophisticated defenses of democracy that are out there right now are defenses that say the reason democracy works is because of elites, right? The average voter doesn't know much of anything, but they pick elites who have some incentive to do the right thing, and they're doing okay. So if you think about some of the recent books that have come out in political philosophy defending electoral democracy, that's their argument. It works because of the elitism. Yeah, sure, there can be pernicious elite capture, but there's also benefits from elites. So, elite capture is not special to epistocracy. It's not special to democracy. It's not even, by the way, and if you were worried about it, you should be worried about it with regard to these other fields as well. So I don't see just to summarize, federalism is not a competitor to epistocracy. The question is, should we have federal or non-federal democracy, or federal or non-federal epistocracy, or federal or non-federal dictatorship? That's another option, right? Federal or non-federal
So
autocracy.
yeah, you've answered perfectly what was I thinking about. Um, when I was before when you were answering Puccini and the others, you basically already answered my question with the worries that I had. So there are if you have the time, we have only two more questions from the audience. Um, okay. So Mateus Santiago, he asks you that he said that he sent you an email a long time ago, and you both exchanged some words. And what's your opinion on the article? There is no right to a competent electorate.
Uh, who's that by? Was that by Brian Kogelman?
Mateus can answer that. Just a
Yeah.
second. Uh,
Yeah, I remember reading it and thinking it had a point, but I can't remember the specific argument that they made. Um, I think he was trying to argue that like if I remember correct, I might be getting it wrong. I think he was trying to argue something like this. I have this view that says you have a right to competent government when the decision is high stakes enough. And he was trying to argue that like the electorate's decisions were not sufficiently high stakes to qualify under that principle. And then so then that comes down to like kind of an empirical question between us, but I can't quite remember if that was what his argument was. So I might be mischaracterizing it with this response then. But if that's what it was, I would just say something like there are people that try to push that line against me. They're like, well, maybe political, like voters' decisions don't matter that much anyway. It's what the members of parliament does, what the Congress does, is what, the bureaucracy does. It's what my neighbors do. Like when I'm living in, I'm at home right now, like in my, studio in my garage. And if I go like this and wave my fingers around, I'm pointing at the US government. Like literally, like my neighbor over there is an admiral in one of the military branches. My neighbor over there worked for the CIA. My neighbor over here works for the State Department. My neighbor over here works for the State Department. They're the government, right? Their decisions matter much more than my vote, which is true. They have way higher impact than my vote does. The danger, though, of saying that is the more you push the line that the electorate doesn't matter, the harder it is to defend democracy, anyways. It's like, we don't have to control what they say because they don't matter anyway. And it's like, well, then why let them vote? Right. And then also you get into implications like, I have here a magic wand. It was a ruler. I lied. It's actually a magic wand. When I wave this magic wand, it will make the electorate fully informed and fully irrational. Do you think it would be a good thing for me to wave this magic wand? If their votes don't matter, then the answer is no, it doesn't matter, right? It won't make any difference whatsoever. Um, but I'm not sure that's fair because I did read that paper, but I really can't remember what the argument was. So I'm not sure if that's the right response to it.
okay. Fernando Moreno asks, what's your view on the current state of the effective altruism movement?
Yeah, like any movement, the problem with movements is that they're movements. So you get people who, you know, the weird thing about effective altruism is that it started as a thing to complain about people showing off how they vote, right? It was about sorry, not how they vote, how they give. The point of giving is to help. It's not to show off, right? But then, like any movement, when it becomes an organized group of people that are interacting with one another, they start having all sorts of weird pernicious influences and weird signaling behaviors and so on. So as a movement, it looks pretty bad. People like seem really silly. There's been a lot of public embarrassments. But fundamentally, the idea is still the basic idea is still fundamentally right. The basic idea is just Henry Hazlitt's economics in one lesson applied to giving. When you're giving, it matters what the results are. It doesn't matter if you don't have to be a consequentialist who thinks you always must do the maximal good to think that that matters. It makes a difference. Like, are you actually helping? Is it what effect are you having on the margins? Can you get a bigger bang for your buck? Are you actually making things worse or not having much of an effect on all at all? Regardless of your background moral philosophy, you should be concerned about those things. And if you ask people to say, of course I am, but they're not. They're actually not. They don't do anything about it. So you should be concerned about those things. And if you discipline yourself, you would be better at giving. It's just microeconomics applied to giving behavior. And that fundamental insight is right. So I often think about the effective altruist movement is kind of like the Libertarian Party in the United States. It's like, oh, so you're pretty libertarianish overall, Jay. So do you vote for the Libertarian Party? And I'm like, nah, they're nuts. Like that, they're a mess. Like I don't know what the hell's going on with those people. But they're just a big mess of weirdos, and they're not even particularly libertarian. They're like so in the same way. Like I don't think the effective altruist movement is nearly as bad, but when I see a movement of people who call themselves something screw up, it doesn't necessarily mean the fundamental idea is wrong. And by the way, that applies to lots of other things. I think if you were, say, for instance, imagine you have a completely different ideology. You're like a radical socialist. If you look at like the socialist parties in the US, those people, you don't want them running things. They're just like mentally ill weirdos, right? Who like don't know what they're doing. But that doesn't necessarily mean your ideas are wrong, just because like the people that are part of this movement are such weirdos. Again, I don't want to compare effective altruists to that. They're way better off than either of those groups. But again, the idea can be right even if the movement is bad. Or actually take one more example. Like you often hear people say things like this. Well, Christianity's wrong because look at what assholes Christians are. It's like, well, first of all, Christianity says people are assholes, so that's not surprising. But secondly, it's like the people who adhere to a movement might suck even if the idea is right.
So the last one, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, Mokelan. Uh, he asks you if there is a country that approximates to an epistocratic system.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm not really sure if there is. Because people would say things like, "Oh, you must mean like Singapore, right?" But Singapore is more of a technocracy than an epistocracy, and those are things we should distinguish. A technocratic government would be a government that's run by a small group of high elites who make a lot of social engineering decisions. And you can be a Democrat who favors technocracy so defined, and you can be an epistocrat who rejects it. So, for instance, say Tom Cristiano, I think is very strongly in favor of technocracy. He tends to like lots of government regulation decided by elites, by my neighbors, the people who work for the government. He likes that kind of thing, but he also wants democratic voting. So he's a Democrat technocrat. So there's a question about how democratic Singapore is, but I wouldn't say it's an instance of what I have in mind. Which is not to criticize it or defend it. It's just I don't really think there is an instance of this kind of thing out there. I'm engaging in kind of like informed speculation about something that might work better, but I don't really know if it will.
So, okay. Uh, we're closing the audience questions, and we will finish this interview by asking you, since you are a big fan of rock and roll, like I am, like Jose is, I also play guitar too. And what song do you recommend that talks about freedom or is a very libertarian song in a way?
A freedom libertarian song. I mean, I guess if you had to make it libertarian, you have to go to Rush. Isn't that where you
Yeah,
go?
yeah.
Yeah,
So there's
yeah,
things like
true.
The Trees by Rush is a good one. Free Will is about personal freedom and also free will, but it has like a libertarian spirit. Um, I even think, the song Limelight, it's not obvious, but Limelight is about being concerned with your like being excellent rather than being looking good to others, which is not an inherently libertarian message, but it's a message that many libertarians resonate with. There's other Rush songs that are like that, but I mean, Rush is the sort of libertarian sounding band just because of the lyrics of Neil Peart. Uh, so yeah, that would be the place to go. Plus, it's good music. It's
Yeah,
sophisticated by hard rock. It's sophisticated by general musical standards. It's often in weird time signatures. The bass player and the drummer were really excellent, and the guitar player is pretty good too. So yeah, go with Rush. But yeah, I guess if you had to hear a libertarian sounding song, "The Trees" by Rush, like there's a good place to
all
start.
right.
In the history,
So
Professor
thank you,
Brennan,
Professor. Uh,
one question, sorry. In the history of rock and
all
roll,
right.
what's your favorite guitarist? My favorite
My
is
favorite
David
guitarist?
Gilmour, like David Gilmour, I think my favorite.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Gilmore is great. I love Pink Floyd. For me personally, the ones who've had the most influence on the way that I play are Nuno Bettencourt of Extreme, Randy Rhoads, John Petrucci, and Eddie Van Halen. I play many different styles of music. I mean, I'm playing in a pit orchestra for Anything Goes over the next few months. I'll be playing mostly jazz over the next few months. But when I sit down and you hand me a guitar, the way that I think about guitar is like the way Nuno Bettencourt would think about guitar. Like that's like the immediate thing that pops into my head, if nothing else.
I wish I
So
could
yeah,
play
but go
jazz.
Nuno.
It's a very difficult style for me. It never sits well in my head when I'm trying to play. I always mess up when I'm trying to play jazz. So we'll be finishing this interview. Jose, your last words?
Professor Brennan, it's an honor to talk to you. Thank you so much for accepting my invite. It's best wishes your family, your studies, in your classes.
Yeah, thanks very much. I appreciate you guys having me on here. It's an honor that you're interested in talking to me for over an hour, and thanks to the audience for their questions and so on. It's always gratifying that people pay attention to what you have to say. I appreciate it.
It was a great honor to have you here, Professor. I'm very grateful for that, and hope we can talk some more another day.
Sounds good.
Bye bye, guys. Talk to
Bye.
you.